We are here with Lionel Shriver, who we had the great good pleasure to have join us in Bogota from Filbo, from the International Book Fair. Lionel is the author of 15 books, only 14. She's also a columnist for The Guardian, two essays published in Harper's. And where else are you publishing?
Actually, I'm not a regular columnist for The Guardian. I was for a little while, but now I have a regular column in a UK magazine called The Spectator.
Okay.
And I am also a columnist at Harper's Magazine.
And I've read some of your essays, and we'll talk about that later. For better or worse, I think to our audience, you're best known for a book called We Need to Talk About Kevin, because it was made into a major motion picture. And actually, that's something I wanted to start by talking to you about. You wrote that book. The book, some people call it a novel of terror. I don't know that I saw it as a novel of terror. It's very introspective. The main character, Eva Kachadorian, isn't necessarily the most likable person in the world. Sympathetic, maybe.
Well, she starts out from a position that is intrinsically unsympathetic. And that is, she is admittedly, as of the very first chapter, the mother of one of these high school killers. And certainly when I wrote the book, and I'm not sure this has changed very much, the mothers really got it in the neck, even more than fathers, for not having been aware of what was going on with their kid and, not having raised them right.
If you look at, we just had the 20th anniversary of Columbine, and one of the mothers of one of the Columbine killers actually has been very, very active on the lecture circuit talking about her experiences. Do you think that she's had a revindication of sorts? And do you think that at the end of your book, Eva does?
I'm not sure. I mean, I can't speak for the real mother. Since I've been through my school shooting phase, I did not read her book. I did read the excerpt that was in the Guardian Weekend magazine, and that convinced me that I didn't have the stamina to stay with the subject for a whole book. She seems to have made her peace with it in a way, and maybe that's what ultimately my character does, and it does take years. So she doesn't get vindicated exactly, but it's more coming to an accommodation with what happened and accepting it and forging a relationship with her son in spite of what he did.
Her experience is incredibly traumatic. And through the book, you see her analyzing herself. And I think I'm a mom. Anytime my kid does something wrong, I kind of overanalyze it myself as well. How do you get through those emotions when you create a character that has that sort of a situation and they're trying to get it through themselves? How do you deal with those emotions? Does it take a lot out of you?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, there are a lot of people who have asked me whether I found writing that book terribly depressing and draining.
So I'm not being original, sorry.
And the only thing I find draining and depressing is writing badly. So as long as the book was working, even if what I was writing was horrifying or alarming, I was having a wonderful time because it was working. It was effective. It was interesting and fun to read. And, writers are also their own first readers. So you're entertaining yourself. You're your own first audience. So the only parts of the book that I found disheartening to write were the parts that I eventually edited out because they sucked.
You have a reputation for being straightforward. This is a really, really, really trite question, but I have to ask it because, I don't know, I feel like being trite today. What inspired you? Where did you get the idea to write about the school shooting? That whole concept.
I got the idea from the newspaper. So I didn't invent the phenomenon of the school shooting. Although oddly, I was already at work on this book before Columbine. So I did not get the idea from Columbine.
Wow. And usually we think of, and as I was reading the book and I was talking to one of my sons about it, usually you think of before Columbine. I don't really remember school shootings, and I'm no kid. And now we don't even talk about Columbine anymore. We talk about Parkland.
There were any number of incidents which actually are events, that is the news coming in of them are events in Kevin. So those two kids at Columbine didn't invent school shootings either. They get a little too much credit.
Well, Eva goes through quite the history of school shootings when she's talking about the different things, and she goes on, it's almost a litany of the names of students who've done things like this. But I guess Columbine was the one that really hit us all, and now people don't talk about it. My 17-year-old son, I said to him something about Columbine, and he said, huh? I said, think Parkland 20 years ago. And interestingly, also, in Kevin, it's not a treatise on gun control. And I think people who know the idea is that this is about the mother of someone who has a school massacre, people might go into it thinking, oh, this is going to be another book about gun control. But it's not. I very
specifically made it not about gun control.
I was going to ask you about that.
My culprit doesn't use a gun.
No, he doesn't use a gun. It's almost more, if I can say this, elegant what he does. But you specifically went in to make sure that it wasn't about gun control.
Yes, I removed that element from the equation because I wouldn't have wanted to read a book that was mostly about gun control.
Thank you, because I wouldn't have either. Looking at your other characters, Big Brother. Big Brother, you've talked about the fact that in your family it maybe was a bone of contention because you were inspired by someone in your own family. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I lost my older brother to the complications of morbid obesity in 2009. And this is the book that I wrote subsequently called Big Brother, which used that experience as a jumping off place, is a good example of basically how I get my ideas, which is often an intersection of the public and the private. I was going through the grieving of my sibling, but at the same time, my brother didn't invent getting fat, right? It's everywhere, and it's a big social problem. So it's not just something that happened in my family, and that means that it had potential relevance to other people. There are going to be a lot of aspects of my family that may not be, as they say, relatable, but this one was, and so I could write a book that it killed two birds with one stone. I got to work through my loss, and also tell a story which I hope resonated with people who have also various senses of exasperation in relation to weight, because I didn't want to write a book that was chiding about, you just have to eat more celery. I wouldn't want to read that book either. I'm exasperated by how important it is to people what they weigh,
Mhm.
and how we make judgments about people in accordance with what they weigh. And it's it's actually a way of not seeing people when all you see is what size they are. And yet it's become a consuming neurosis of Western society. And it's one of the main things that people compete with each other over. And so I wanted to explore some of these issues. But I did not write about what actually happened in my family. I made up a plot completely. And that's pretty par for the course. I mean, what gave me the idea for Kevin wasn't just the newspaper, but it was also that I was trying to work through whether or not I would ever have a child.
Mm-hmm.
By the time I finished writing that book, I realized I probably shouldn't have one. But again, that's that I was working through something for myself, but that also had pertinence to other people's lives, and meaning that, that there was potential audience for the book, that it would have meaning. The subject matter was meaningful to other people, and I think that's very important when you're choosing the topics, especially for a whole book, which is a lot of work. Is anybody else going to care? Is this of interest to anyone besides yourself? Now, sometimes the sheer strength of your conviction can carry the book. You're so interested in something that you make your audience interested in it. Mm-hmm. But it's still worth asking yourself before you begin a project why someone else has any reason to care about your story.
You've talked about creating characters that people don't necessarily have to like. Has there been at any point in the process when you were writing, I don't know, if you were writing The World Post-Birthday, where Irina bugged you? Is there any point where you wrote a character doing something and you said, you idiot?
Oh, all the
but
time.
But continued?
Yeah. One of the things that you can play with in fiction is reader frustration. Mm-hmm. Frustration is it's an emotion with a lot of energy. So that when you have the reader saying, "Oh, don't do that, you moron! That's the last thing you should do. This is going to end horribly." Well, you've got your reader involved and exercised, and that's that creates a lot of momentum, involvement, and energy. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only writer who does it on purpose. Drive your reader crazy.
You drove me crazy a couple of times, particularly in Kevin, with reference to Franklin.
Yeah, that was quite deliberate.
But Eva doesn't see it. Franklin, with all due respect, is kind of an ass. And Eva just loves him selflessly. Or am I misreading?
Oh, she finds him frustrating also. But this is the see no evil dad, who mm-hmm. accepts a kind of Archie comic version of having a son. Mm-hmm. Going out and playing frisbee in the yard, and he doesn't really pick up what's going on underneath.
But Kevin manipulates the hell out of him with that. I mean, Kevin makes himself the Archie comic.
Yes, it's and the mother can see it and the father can't. But the reader, that's the whole point. The reader can see it also. So
but there were moments when I said...
It's the reader who gets very frustrated.
But there were moments as I was reading it saying, okay, no, something's going to happen here. Eva's going to be the crazy one. Because it seemed Kevin was almost like Damien from The Omen. Did you set out for that? Because this to me is sort of Kevin is the least, and I don't mean this as not a compliment. He's the least realistic of the characters your characters in the books that I've read, and I have not read all 14.
I don't think of him that way. I mean, there may be an element of the stylized.
Because
But-
he's so unabashedly evil.
No, I disagree with that.
Tell me more.
The whole idea of the book was to play with whether it was the boy's fault or his mother's fault. Was he the result of bad mothering, or was there something wrong with him to begin with? You know, the bad seed thing. But that is not a question that the book ever quite answers. And the truth is that there are a lot of things about Kevin that I ended up starting to like. He's very bright.
He's brilliant.
He's funny.
He's articulate.
He's incredibly dry.
Mm-hmm.
He has a sense of humor. And I mean, I didn't necessarily set out when I started that book expecting to like him, but he started to charm me.
Well, there's the scene where they go out for the mother and son date, where he basically reads her the riot act and tells her exactly
What's
what is
wrong
with her.
And he's right.
And he's absolutely right. So I see your point. How did you feel, and I don't know if you can speak to this, the book, Eva spends so much time analyzing herself and analyzing Kevin and not analyzing Franklin. The movie obviously doesn't do that. Do you feel that the movie did justice to the book, or that any movie does justice to a book? Or are they just intrinsically going to be different?
They are intrinsically going to be different. There are films that are extremely faithful to the novels they're based on. I'm thinking off the top of my head of Richard Yates' Revolutionary Road.
Mm-hmm.
And I happened to reread that book right before going to see the film, and I discovered that the dialogue is all perfectly taken from the book. There are very few screenwriters who are that faithful. And I think it worked, too, because Yates writes great dialogue. In fact, I think the film of Kevin might have been a little bit better. This is my vanity talking, if it had used a little bit more of my dialogue. Because it was so well cast that when those actors got their teeth into a scene where the conversation really sizzled, it really took off.
What's it like to see your work on screen, to see someone else's interpretation of your work, the director's interpretation?
I mean, I don't think there's a generic answer to that, because I think sometimes when your book is turned into a film, it can be quite painful. Because, the film is terrible. And I lucked out in that respect. Certainly the film of Kevin is not terrible. There were a few decisions made that I would have made otherwise. But my feeling was that it was a very separate thing, and in some ways didn't belong to me. It was not my creation. I think if anyone ever does, have that experience of, someone's bought your book, the best advice is to let it go. Don't get too involved, and regard it as someone else's work, because you still get to keep your book, right? Mm-hmm. No matter what happens to the film, the book is still intact. You still own it, your name is still on it, and every word is still in place. So there's a way in which, it's the perfect situation whereby you sell something and keep it at the same time. It's like the ultimate, having cake and eat it too.